Good morning. Good morning again to everybody. Thank you all for being here. Since I first started this festival 5 years ago, to this day that I'm looking at this full crowded room, I can't quite believe how it's taken off, and it's all thanks to you who are supporting and attending. So welcome all, and I'm glad to have you all back in the room. We're in for another treat today. Joining us is Ben Macintyre, one of Britain's finest writers of narrative history. His best-selling works have brought to life the extraordinary true stories that have shaped the 20th century. And as if that wasn't good enough, he'll be in conversation with Will Smith, the award-winning screenwriter behind the TV adaptation of Slow Horses, among other great shows. But before we begin, it's my great pleasure to welcome in person this year's Young Writers author. We have a competition for short stories by different age groups, and this year's young writer who's in the audience today is Phoebe Smith. So congratulations, Phoebe. Now, this next part is a little bit awkward for me because I promise you it's blind grading, and nobody on the literature committee knew who was writing. But the Phoebe Smith I'm referring to is, in fact, the daughter of Will Smith. This was not rigged. And if I could give you this for Phoebe.
Thank you.
On her behalf, and welcome you onto the stage.
Thank you.
Will Smith and Ben Macintyre.
Oh, sorry, I'm an idiot. Immediately sat in the wrong chair. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Hello. Oh, okay. Yeah, that's a good start. Yes. Now, Ben has written many fantastic books, which are all over there. We're going to veer into all of them, and also just your sort of general approach. But I'd really love to start on The Siege, which I have the privilege of adapting for Channel 4, which is super exciting. Now, for those of you who don't know, it's about the Iranian embassy siege in 1980, where a group of Iranian Arabs marched into the Iranian embassy in London, opened fire, took the building hostage, and the siege lasted 6 days, at which point it was broken up by the SAS. It went into the building, which was on live TV, which was a huge kind of moment in sort of British history, effectively. But interestingly, for such a big moment, that's pretty much all I could remember of it. I remember it happening, but in my memory it's like, oh, they went in, and then the SAS went in, and that's the big thing. And there is so much more to that story. So I wanted to ask you first, what drew you to that? Why did you decide that was going to be the topic of your next book? And did you have any idea of the treasure trove of complex human relationships that you were going to uncover when you started digging into it?
Absolutely not. And let me also say, I'm one of about 6 people that has actually read Will's draft of the screenplay of these events. And I'm just telling you now, the final episode, which covers about 11 minutes of the SAS attack, is going to be the most exciting television you'll ever see. Far better than Slow Horses. Forget about it. This is really fast horses, and it's extraordinary. It's going to be wonderful, I think. Yes, I mean, I took this particular episode on with some trepidation, because it is so well known to a certain sort of Brit over the age of 45 that the moment when the SAS crashed into that building, which is, as Will says, was on live television, was quite unlike anything we've ever seen before. I remember it vividly. I was 17 years old, and I was watching the snooker final. Alex Hurricane Higgins, you'll all remember it, against Cliff the Grinder Thorburn. And it had come down to the final 2 frames, and it was as exciting as snooker ever gets, by the way. It really was. It was thrilling, and it was the Embassy snooker final, because it was sponsored by Embassy cigarettes, and everybody smoked, including the players, all the way through. In fact, all you can hear on the soundtrack is people coughing. And there was a wonderful moment when we were watching this with my dad. It was Bank Holiday Monday, and suddenly the television froze, and I thought our television had gone wrong again. But the announcer said, and now we go from one embassy to another. And they shot over to this live footage of men in balaclava helmets throwing bombs into a large Georgian townhouse and then storming in through the windows. And I honestly, I thought it was a film. I thought we'd just accidentally gone over to the other side. But it was a moment of incredible drama. And it had a real impact on Britain, I think, for lots of reasons, really. But it was Thatcher had only been in power for less than a year at this point. And it became a kind of leitmotif of her premiership in a way, that kind of, for both good and ill, both her kind of resolve, but also some of her pig-headedness as well. And it's so in that way, it was a very key historical moment, I think. But yes, to answer your question, which you had, yes, I mean, I had a very simple idea about what this story was about.
Yeah.
I thought it was going to be a story about brave British chaps going in and sort of, doing the right thing and killing the baddies and freeing the hostages. And of course, there is a great adventure story in the middle of it. But actually, in the end, it turned out to be a very different sort of book. I found I was sort of really writing about character and the personalities of the people who were held inside that building. There were 27 hostages. And they all responded to this situation of grave peril in very different ways. I mean, we'd all like to think that in those circumstances, we would acquit ourselves in ways that would be creditable. And some did, but some didn't. And not all human beings are made of kind of straight-grained SAS-type timber. People respond in very different ways. And I found that absolutely fascinating. The level of sort of psychology this book involved was far greater than I ever thought it would be.
It's also what completely drew me in from the start was the motivations of the gunmen, because obviously it's sort of a Iranian embassy, hostage crisis, and so in my head I just thought, well, it's obviously going to have some kind of religious component, and that must have been what they were doing, because it's 9/11, that's how you kind of interpret that region. And it's not that case at all. So could you talk a bit about the motivations of the gunmen, who to me, again, like you say, I sort of went into the book thinking, this is going to be all about the SAS, and the SAS is going to be the heroes. And, as you say, to some extent they are, but what really kind of went in deep with me was these confused and manipulated and very damaged young men who I feel, a degree of sympathy for.
Yeah. I mean, you and me both, Will. I mean, I also thought this must be really about Islamic fundamentalism.
Yes,
It's 1980. The Iranian Revolution has just taken place. The hostage drama, the American hostages held in Tehran are still being held there. They'll be held for another year. So I assumed when I first hit this project that was what it was about. But it's not about that at all. These 6 young Arabs, were Iranian Arabs. They came from the southwestern part of Iran, the oil-rich bit. And what they really wanted was autonomy, or rather, they wanted a measure of self-government in that part of Iran. So they believed that the revolution was going to bring them this. They had been promised by Khomeini's people that they would be given a level of autonomy. That didn't happen. They were brutally repressed. And the Revolutionary Guard was sent in to put down this protest in southwest Iran with unbelievable brutality. Hundreds of people were slaughtered in the streets. And each one of these young men had lost family members as a result. So it's that old cycle of violence. They were opposed to the Ayatollah. This was a demonstration against the Islamic regime, not because of its Islamic nature, but it was a political protest. And it was very naive. I mean, they believed that they were going to be able to storm into this embassy, take a few Iranian diplomats hostage, and then they thought they would be able to barter their release for prisoners held in Iran, and then they thought they were going home. They thought that the British government would provide them with a plane, and then they would just be able to go back to the Middle East. So the whole thing was based on this kind of naive misunderstanding, really, and they were being manipulated. They had been trained by the Iraqis. The whole thing was a plot put together by Saddam Hussein and his intelligence services. It was a way for the Iraqis to use the Arab minority in Iran to destabilize the Ayatollah. So in a way, it was the precursor to the Iran-Iraq war, which would erupt just a few months later. So in a way, the first conflict of that war was being fought out on the streets of London. Now, most people had no idea of that, and no one had ever really, interestingly, I think, no one had ever really tried to investigate who these 6 young men were. They were simply presented in history as if they were, a kind of empty vessels, really. They were just the terrorists, whereas each of them had their own complicated reason for doing what they did. And I'm not justifying it. We won't in the TV series. This isn't an excuse for what they did. They were These were men of violence. They were prepared to kill and to be killed. But they nonetheless had a reason for doing what they were doing, or they thought they did. So, and that is true of all human nature. Nobody operates in a vacuum. And digging out their confused and contradictory and in some ways very naive approach to the whole thing was one of the great challenges of this book.
It's one of the many great strengths of the book as well. It's just the human portrait that you give of these men. So what is that process then when you're trying to investigate the background of people who, they killed 45 years ago and any of their relatives are presumably dead, or if they are alive, they're in Iran, you can't get access to them. How did you mine the background and bring them to life in that way?
Well, oddly enough, even though their relatives are all in Iran, they are still accessible.
Oh.
It's very odd. You can still do a certain amount of... I can't go to Iran. But nonetheless, you can get access to sources in Iran. And I did speak to the sort of relatives, and they were very young, these men. They were all in their 20s. But I did manage to find family members and others who had belonged to these dissident protest groups, many of them in exile. There's a very large Iranian Arab community in London, the Ahwazi community, and they were incredibly helpful at sort of digging out the background to this story. But it's yes, in some ways it's a story that sort of has always been presented in a kind of rather one-dimensional way. Bad terrorists, good SAS. The SAS too, I mean, those individuals, their stories have never been told either, because they're just seen as kind of faceless, balaclava-wearing machine gun types. But actually each of those men has their own story too. And the women. There were women inside that embassy. Iranian secretaries mostly. There were 5 of them. And again, their stories have never been told, because the women were sort of written out of the story afterwards. This was a story of male daring do, which it is partly. But actually the women, as you know, play a crucial role in this story. And yet, again, trying to find them was half the fun, really, of trying to dig them out.
It's also just a fascinating fissure within the kind of the Iranians in the embassy, between the women who had largely been there, the sort of young women who'd been there under the kind of Shah's rule. To some extent, they sort of pined for the opulence of those days. Yeah. They were kind of like kind of good time kind of party girls.
Yeah.
And then a few months earlier, the new hardline regime had come in, and you've got to wear the hijab, you've got to do this, you've got to do that, and so there was real kind of conflict within the hostages, which makes for fantastic drama. And again, that's what I get onto. I mean, the title of the conversation is Stranger Than Fiction, and like, if I were going to fictionalize this event, this is exactly what I would do. You set up all these conflicts, and so I wonder, when you're researching it, you slightly kind of rubbing your hands at points, and the moments where you go, "Oh my God, that's amazing!" And
absolutely, well, and particularly those moments where it does seem stranger than fiction.
Yeah.
When there are moments, and I was just loving Matt's presentation earlier, the thought that you've got an endless opportunity to make it up. There are lots of synonyms for shit. And you can find them late at night. I'm anchored down to what I can actually find and what is there.
Yeah.
And when you find those little nuggets that are so extraordinary and yet true, that's a real eureka moment for me. We'll just do one. I mean, for example, and you do it brilliantly in the screenplay. On day 3 of the hostage drama, we're jumping ahead a bit. There was an exchange book. There was a particular character who I love called Ali Gahanzafar Gul.
I was going to ask you about
who was a sort of Pakistani. So the hostages were a mixed bag. Some of them were completely accidental people who just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, including 5 Brits, 2 of them applying for visas, another one who worked there. But there was also this wonderful Pakistani tourist called Gul, who just happened to have wandered in because he was a bit tired. And he'd been wandering around the park, at Hyde Park all morning, and he pretended he'd gone in to do an interview. He hadn't. He was quite overweight, and he wanted to sit down for a while. And he got swept up into this terrifying hostage drama. But he could never quite work out what was going on, because he kept saying to the gunman, I've got a plane to catch. Could I go now? And the other point about Ali Gul was that he was quite eccentric, but he also snored like a train. I mean, really loudly. And every night he was keeping everyone awake, including the gunman. So on day 3, when there was a sort of hostage exchange situation happened, the gunman was thinking, who are we going to get? Let's get rid of him. So Ali Gul basically snored his way to freedom.
Yeah.
But if you put that in a novel,
you'd never.
You wouldn't get the editors would say that.
That would never happen. I know if I put that in the series, they would absolutely just go, I don't believe it. It's too broad. It undermines the reality. And you're like, but it actually happened. Thank God.
But it's odd, isn't it? Because the humour. I mean, this sounds an odd thing to say of a 6-day terrifying hostage drama. There are deaths. There are murders take place. It's very dramatic and unpleasant. Yet there is this kind of strange vein of comedy that runs through it, and I think that is true of almost all really tense and difficult situations. It's one of the ways human beings, I think, cope with stress is to find a kind of black humour in the worst moments. And they, as this situation went on, and as the hostages got to know each other and got to know the gunman, they developed this kind of strange black comic approach to it. They started telling each other jokes and had internal jokes with each other, and I loved all of that because there's something very humanising about that. Again, it sort of takes us away from a simple moral story of black and white.
But it also it's very interesting actually, really, because one of the sort of questions people always had about Slow Horses when we were trying to sort of get it off the ground was kind of sort of, is it comedy, is it drama, and we're worried that the humour will sort of undermine the tone. My approach has always been that drama is on a spectrum, and if you take out the humour, I actually think you undermine the reality more if you take out the humour than if you include it, and it's all part of it. So seeing all that in reality, it sort of really sort of felt it strengthened my kind of belief in that you can do drama in that way, and it's more reflective of human life, and it's more engaging, and you believe it more, because otherwise I find in TV, if you don't have that element, you just end up watching something and it sounds like people are saying the sort of things they say in TV shows rather than the sort of things they say in real life.
Yeah.
And having a man who snores and tells boring stories like he does, who doesn't understand that he's being held at gunpoint and keeps saying, I have a plane to catch, is just... Yeah. It's just wonderfully rich and real.
Yeah, I think that's right. And particularly the spy world. I know we're getting away from the siege here, but often people in intelligence do have an awareness of the absurdity of what they're doing. So there is a kind of ridiculousness to all of that is sort of built into it. And I know you've met quite a lot of the real agent runners, and I have too, and they are often these rather oddball people who are slightly off kilter. They're not necessarily as kind of as slow as the Slow Horses types, or indeed as inefficient. But they are nonetheless different, and they're often very alive to their own sense of humour. I remember the first time I went into Thames House to meet some of these people, and a huge guy with a sort of great forked beard and sort of 3 earrings came barreling up and said, "I'm the chief agent runner." And really, I mean, if you saw this guy on a bus, you'd have got off. I mean, he looked absolutely terrifying. And I said, "What do you do?" He said, "Well, my name's Wayne." He said, "He was Welsh." He said, I spend a lot of time in very unpleasant pubs, talking to very unpleasant people, and trying to persuade them to do things they don't really want to do. I thought that was a great definition of what agent runners actually do. But he was sort of bonkers, too.
So how do you get access to these? I know you get asked this all the time, so I'll address it towards the siege, actually. The SAS, how did you get access to them, and how comfortable were they with you telling the story, and did they put any limits on you?
Well, that was the trickiest element of all of this, because I'd written a book about the SAS before, Rogue Heroes, which was the wartime SAS, and that was an authorised book, so I got full access to their archive. And when I was writing that book, I asked them at the time, I said, I'd love to write about the embassy siege. And they said, on the same basis, I said, can I have access to the files? And they said, absolutely not. You're not going to get access to the files because it's too new. It's 1980. This is a time when the SAS is operating in Northern Ireland. If we start releasing files to you for that episode, but we're still holding back the files on Northern Ireland, we're going to look, we can't do that. But after a lot of persuading, they finally said, but you can interview the surviving SAS people who'd taken part in the assault. Most of these men had never talked about this before. They had not been allowed to. 1 or 2 of them had broken ranks. But we got an official permission from the Ministry of Defence to talk to all of them. And that was a real breakthrough, because their memories, it's often the way with collective memory, I think, because they had only ever spoken to each other about what had happened, there was a kind of received wisdom about what had taken place, which actually wasn't quite true. And one of the interesting things was sort of bouncing the real records. So I got the Metropolitan Police records, most of those. So I knew what was happening on that side. I wasn't going to get the written stuff from the SAS, but piecing together what had actually happened moment to moment through their memories was extraordinarily, well, it was, I found it very rewarding, really, partly because they had never talked about it before, and being released to do so was, I think, a catharsis for some of them. And some of them found it very moving, that this was the most essential, most exciting moment of their lives, and yet somehow they were able to sort of, to let it go.
And am I right then that this book has the most amount of living subjects that you've ever dealt with?
Absolutely. No, mostly I'm up until now, except for the Gordievsky book, I'm mostly
him. So did that change your process and your approach? So when you're, like, sort of two questions here really, is like, when you're sitting with them, are you already kind of mining the character and thinking, oh, I do this, and that fits there, or are you getting it all down and then that's something that happens later?
I usually get it all down in a splurge.
Right.
The wonders of AI allow me to do an interview now and instantly get a transcript afterwards. So I can in a way, they forget the interview is taking place, and so do I. I don't take notes.
Oh, it's all just.
So it's all
okay.
Which is a great advantage. So people are freer, I think.
Yeah.
They feel freer.
So they don't feel like they're being interviewed. They
exactly.
feel like it's more of a conversation.
More of a conversation.
But your brain at that point is not on the book, or is it?
Oh, it is. It is, and I'm steering.
You're steering it to think what gaps that you think I need that confirmed. So, and that's the journalist in you as well.
Yeah, isn't it? Absolutely. But the other thing, Will, is that people long to tell their stories.
Yeah,
they do. Every human being has a story. If you're in the secret world, you're only really allowed to tell that story to a few people, or in theory. Once you're released from that bond, it comes pouring out. That's why spies are so indiscreet. I mean, once you switch on a spy, it's almost impossible to switch them off again.
Really?
I mean, they just keep going because they have a vivid memory of this thing that they've never been able to kind of share with anybody.
And of course, it's that impulse. If you've done this amazing thing that's a secret, it's sort of not that cool unless
someone
it's like, this is a slight sidebar, but I always remember it. Did you ever see The Jinx? Yeah. And when Jinx was Robert Durst, who was this billionaire who people had been murdered around him, and it always looked like it was him who'd gotten away with it. And then for some reason he sat down and did this interview for a series, and then he still had the mic on when he went to the loo right at the end and goes to the toilet and says something on the lines of, I killed them all, or something. And everyone was like, that's insane, why did he do that? Why did he agree to be interviewed? He'd gotten away with it, and then he gives himself away. And I was always like, but it's not saying I'm in this frame of mind, but I was thinking, if you've literally gotten away with murder, you want people to know. Otherwise, there's no kind of aha.
Yeah.
And I sort of think a spy is similar to that.
Yeah, they really, and SAS people too. I mean, I think again the very vividness of what they've done and not being able to share it. But dealing with memory is a very tricky element.
I suppose if they're telling you something and you know from 3 other sources that didn't happen, you can't.
That's often the trickiest moment. Is somebody will. They're not lying. I mean, we all think, don't we, that our memories are true. That what we recall of an event, because we were there, is accurate and truthful, but of course it isn't. The stories we tell about ourselves are the narratives we tell to kind of make sense of our lives. They're not absolute truth, and you can have a number of people, but many people who have witnessed the same thing at the same time, and they will have completely contrasting memories of what took place. So one of the difficulties is having to say to people, I know you were there, but actually it wasn't like that at all. I mean, for example, to give you one example in the siege, I was told by more than one person, at one point in the siege, a police marksman hidden inside a van in Hyde Park took a shot at one of the gunmen and killed him stone dead. And I was told this by about 3 different people. And I said, I'm sorry, I have to tell you, that didn't happen. And I was there. But it didn't happen. I know it didn't happen because I've got the autopsy reports. There was nobody died that way. So that's a tricky moment where you are telling people that their own recollections of their own lives are inaccurate.
So what responsibility do you feel when you're then putting those real people into the book? And for the first time, this book, there are people there who, at the time, and they're going to read this book. Like, particularly, like, for instance, Sim Harris, who's a fascinating character, who's a BBC kind of sound recordist who's caught up in it, and who ends up, because he works for the BBC, he ends up, saying, I can speak to someone from the BBC, and they send his boss over, and because Thatcher has said no negotiation, no budging, then they're not broadcasting the demands, but Sim is getting very annoyed at this, and getting very annoyed with with the police and is sort of insulting them and is also sort of cozying up to some extent to not cozying up. The MI5 and the police have the suspicion that he is cozying up to them. They can hear on the audio that and they sort of describe him in the book as like a loose cannon. And somebody says, we thought he was a very dangerous individual.
Well, we should probably explain that. One of the things that the police and MI5 did right from the beginning was to mount an audio assault on the building. So they began to drill micro probes through the walls on either side. Now the walls are that thick, and they were doing this with hand drills. So they would very carefully make this microscopic hole and then feed in tiny little, almost filament microphones and stuff like things you would use in surgery, to try and get them just inside the plasterwork on the other side of the wall so they could hear what was going on. So they had a picture of what was happening, although there's another comic aspect of that too.
Yes,
because the problem with making these holes was they had to use hand drills, and they made a very distinctive noise. They made a kind of squeaking noise, and the gunman inside heard them. And at one point, they summoned the policeman who they'd captured, Trevor Locke, took him upstairs and said, "We think they're going to attack the building. Listen to this." And sure enough, there was this squeaking noise. And Trevor, who was a brilliant character, turned to them and said, "No, I think you've got mice." But they heard that conversation. So the police so they realised this noise was a problem. So they decided they'd have to cover the noise. And the best way to cover a small noise is to make a big noise. So the first thing they did was they contacted the gas board and arranged for two men in overalls with large pneumatic drills to come to the front of the building and start digging an enormous and completely unnecessary hole. And the noise was deafening, and it drove everybody inside mad. So they stopped doing that, and the next thing they did was they contacted the Civil Aviation Authority at Heathrow and arranged to divert the planes that were taking off and landing at Britain's largest airport to fly low over the embassy. So the technicians would wait till they could hear a plane coming. And as it was going over, they'd drill away like mad into the walls. And as the plane sort of disappeared, they'd then stop again. But it worked. But to your point about Sim, they began to develop a kind of understanding of who the different characters were inside there. And Sim Harris, who's still around, I'm delighted to say. In fact, I'm doing a sort of joint thing with him at the Barbican next month. He was extraordinary because right from the beginning, Sim began to take notes of what was going on. Even though he thought they were all going to die, even though he thought the whole building was going to be blown up, some sort of journalistic reflex in him meant that he began keeping this diary. And I've seen it. And for a narrative non-fiction writer, that is absolute gold dust. When you've got somebody who in real time is drawing little caricatures of the people and writing down what they're saying. And in fact, the gunmen saw him keeping his diary and they said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Well, I'm keeping a diary." And they said, "Oh, good. That's brilliant. What are you saying about us?" So they were very conscious of their own...
the legacy.
The legacy they were going to be leaving, but even though they thought they were all going to die or believed they might. So Sim is very interesting, and the police were very uncertain about him because, in a way, he's a perfect example of Stockholm syndrome. Now, you all have heard of Stockholm syndrome. It's named after a famous bank robbery in Stockholm when a gunman took 6 hostages, held them for a week, and those hostages developed very strong feelings about the gunman. They felt a real community of interest with him against the police. And that's what happens in Stockholm syndrome. The hostages, and it happens in almost every hostage situation. I mean, I'm afraid there's appalling hostage situation in Gaza at the moment. Those people will have developed a strange affinity, a kind of bond, believe it or not, with the people who are holding them. It almost always happens. And it began in the embassy siege almost immediately. The hostages began to think, why are the police not ending this? Why are they not agreeing to what we think are perfectly reasonable demands? And by the end of it, and don't forget the police are overhearing this, Sim appears to be moving to the other side. He appears to be working on the gunmen's behalf. He wasn't, actually. But he felt, and still does feel, that they were naive young men. He never refers to them, to this day, he never refers to them as terrorists. He doesn't accept that that's what they were. So, and the flip side of Stockholm syndrome is something called Lima syndrome, much less known, but that is the way that often hostage takers can develop strong feelings for the people they have taken captive. And you get lots of evidence of that in this story as well. The 6 gunmen, particularly the youngest one.
Ali, I don't know if that's a spoiler to talk about that.
Happy
women
to.
at the end point, which is absolutely amazing. If you could talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, at the denouement, we won't give it all away. I mean, it is Operation Nimrod it's quite sort of something. It's 11 minutes, and they attack the building from 6 different vantage points. But right at the end of that, as the hostages are being brought out, and they're all handcuffed, the hostages, because the police and SAS don't know who is a gunman and don't know which ones are hostages. The youngest gunman gets out, and as he was being plastic cuffed,
it's Sim Harris.
Sim Harris said, that man's a gunman. He identified him to the SAS, and the SAS picked him up and began to take him back into the building. Now, what they were planning to do to him is still a matter of great debate both within the SAS and more generally. Some witnesses believed that he was about to be executed, that they were going to take him back inside and finish him off. Many in the SAS said that wouldn't have happened. We would never have done that. But it's still a point of contention. But this is certain. The women hostages, who had grown very fond of this particular young man, who was I think he was 18 years old or 19 years old then.
And he's the most naive.
He had no idea what he was doing.
He thought, we'll go in, fire guns in the air, and then get the plane home. They'd all gone shopping the day before and had all the shopping sent home. They were
like, Oxford Street. He bought new trainers and he was looking forward to wearing them when he got back to the Middle East. I mean, he was an idiot. I mean, anyone who has an 18-year-old boy knows what that's. I mean, sorry, people in the audience, but 18-year-old boys think they're invulnerable, and they don't think about what's going to happen next. They think about the moment. Yeah. And these women had developed. They were very fond of him, and as he was being dragged away, they sort of gathered around him, even though and said, "Don't kill him, don't kill him. He's our brother."
Yeah.
And that possibly, perhaps saved his life.
Yeah.
And so he got out, and he's still around. He's still in the UK.
Yeah, because he served his time, didn't he? But they can't send him back to Iran because the Iranians will execute him for
this. Because this was an anti-regime operation. This was aimed against the Islamic regime. So there is a death sentence waiting for him back there.
We should talk a bit about Trevor Locke, who's absolutely central to the story, but also because in terms of the stranger than fiction, if we can talk about Trevor's gun, which is actually Chekhov's gun in real life, and I find it just the most incredible story beat, for want of a better word, but a real moment. And again, I don't know whether this was widely known before you did your research or you uncovered this, but it's just the most incredible story.
So when the gunman attacked the embassy, technically guarding the embassy was Trevor Locke, who was a diplomatic protection group officer. But the word guarding, the reason I sort of stammered on that is that guarding is a very energetic word for what Trevor was really doing. Trevor was having a cup of coffee, and he was supposed to. His job was to sort of, nod politely to people coming in and out. He took the job because it was boring. Nothing ever happened. As he once said to me, he said, "I was Dixon of Dock Green. I wasn't the Sweeney." He was not a kind of have-a-go hero. But one of the reasons why the gunmen had chosen a British target was that they believed that British policemen didn't carry weapons, which was true of most policemen at that point. But it was not true of diplomatic protection group officers. Each of them carried a revolver, and that was true of Trevor Locke too. So as these 6 gunmen attacked the building, bundling them back in, firing their weapons, glass went into Trevor's face, and with blood pouring down his face, he was sort of bundled into the back. But he had his gun on him. And although the gunmen patted everyone down, they missed his gun. They didn't know that he had this revolver on his hip. And he had a big police tunic on the outside.
And he had 2 jumpers.
He had 2 jumpers because it was a cold day. His wife Doreen had said, you've got to bundle up warmly, Trev, because it's going to be cold on the doorstep. So, and then the weather changed. Of course, it got warmer and warmer as this went on, but he couldn't take off his tunic. And he couldn't take off his jumpers, because if he did, they'd see the gun. But even more extraordinary, he worked out very early on that he couldn't eat or drink anything while he was in the embassy, because then he would have to go to the loo. And if he went to the loo, he'd have to take off his jacket. And if he took off his jacket, they would see the gun. So it's probably the most heroic self-imposed constipation in history. He managed to hold on for almost the whole 6 days. It must have been. He was very funny about it afterwards. He made us. We love our lavatorial humour in Britain. He used to make jokes about it, but actually at the time it must have been excruciatingly uncomfortable.
And also, terrifying. And that's the thing about that story strand, is it has everything you could possibly want. It has tragedy and farce and,
and that gun, of course, like Chekhov's gun, plays. We're not going to tell you what it is.
Yeah, but it
plays a very important part in the final few seconds of this story.
It's an amazing moment that if I fictionalise that, I would be so happy. and reading the book, I was like, oh, I can't wait to do this. It's going to be absolutely incredible.
But one of the lovely things about Trevor, who I got to know quite well, he died, alas, about 2 months ago, was his absolute refusal to accept that he had done anything heroic. He just would not accept that he wouldn't accept that title. He kept, and he wasn't being falsely modest at all. I think he genuinely felt that he'd simply done what anyone else would do. I don't think he did. I think in a quiet, self-effacing way, he probably saved all those lives in that embassy.
He holds it together and calms people down.
He does. He keeps the whole thing.
And they start to look to him like,
as an
the
authority.
lead gunman that looks at him like an authority/father figure to take his guidance and his...
and he sort of realised it almost unconsciously, I think, that he had to maintain a position as a kind of authority figure. So he kept his peaked cap on, and he took the largest chair in the room, a bit like this actually, a big sort of winged chair, and sort of sat there as if he was an authority figure. But you're absolutely right, the gunman began to trust him. And at one point, and I think this is an example of sort of almost brilliant quotidian heroism, they heard noises down in the basement, or they thought they could hear noises, and they said, Mr. Trevor, we think we're about to be attacked. Will you go downstairs and check, see if there's anyone coming in? So one of the main captive is being sent off downstairs, and as he was going down the stairs, he looked at the front door and he realised that he could open the front door and walk out. He could have saved himself at that moment. But what's so interesting was that never occurred to him at the time. Afterwards, he said, I realised I could have got away. At the time, it never crossed his mind.
I think he felt the responsibility to everyone back upstairs.
Yeah.
It's just the fact he goes back up
and says, no, it's fine, there's no one coming in, we're all right. But that's a great example of Stockholm Syndrome too. I mean, he's sort of...
That's where I belong, back up there.
My place is with, not just with the captives, it's with the gunmen as well.
I better tell them there's no one down here, otherwise they'll get worried.
They'll get worried, I need to calm them down. I mean, it's an extraordinary situation. And in a way, that's why I loved writing this book, is it's an enclosed theatre where everything really takes place inside of a handful of rooms with a handful of people. And when you've got that intensity and you've got a level of research material, and I was so lucky on that you can really tell what really did happen from moment to moment. You can create a kind of jeopardy bubble in a way where all of this is taking place among a few people. And that's a very satisfying thing to be able to write.
And so, as regards to writing, I've got to ask you this, because what I love about your work is that it combines all the kind of the detail and the surprise and the interest of like, historical kind of non-fiction, but with the kind of the page-turning pulse of the thriller. And it's like, at what point do you do the kind of events and then you put your kind of thriller hat on, or is it the same process? But
it's funny. It's the same process in an odd way. I mean, I'm very rigorous that nothing is made up in.
No, but do you have to police that? I mean, I imagine because you're a journalist by trade, it's like you've kind of got that in built. Whereas when I'm doing the adaptation, that I have more license to kind of go, oh well, I know what that character is, so I can imagine they would do this.
Absolutely.
You absolutely can't.
I can't do that.
Do you fight that impulse at points?
Well, these days not. I mean, after sort of
you've done it enough.
I've done it enough times that when you run out of, so you can put words into people's mouths. I can't do that. And the moment I do, if I ever did do that, I'd be writing a novel. I would already have crossed over into different territory. So I think one has to be absolutely rigorous about that. And in fact, even more than that, if I run out of material, and that does happen.
I was going to ask, have you gone into a subject and then gone, there's not enough, or there's not enough key characters?
I have a bottom drawer that is filled with books I'll never write, because you need the warp and weft of the moment. You need to have this really dense amount of material before you can, in absolute honesty, say what happened. But if you do run out, and it does happen, and if I'm writing about a wartime event, there are gaps in the record, always. And I think one owes it to the reader to say that. to say we don't know what happened. We don't know where he ended up, because I think that's the way you earn the trust of the reader. Because that means that when I do say he snored himself to liberty, they know that's true. Yeah. That's not something I'm making up. But I do use novelistic techniques, and I do cliffhangers, and I
end of chapter hooks are just amazing.
I mean, they're great fun to do, and so those are things you would find in a novel. And I'm pretty ruthless. I mean, if something bores me, it doesn't go into my books, and lots of life is rather sort of quotidian.
So you're sort of thinking about the structure as you're doing research. You think about the structure, and you'll know. So you'll know. I've got the end of the chapter there, and I know that goes into that. So you're sort of
absolutely, and certain characters, there were 27 hostages in this story. I really only tell the stories of a dozen of them at most. And with the screenplay, one has to be, I mean, you know this, you have to be even more sort of selective about whose stories you are going to tell, and therefore whose stories you're not. Who are you going to leave out of the story? And that again causes...
so the hostages, you don't tell the story, was that because you didn't, they weren't interesting enough, or you couldn't find the material on them?
A combination of both. Yeah. Some I could find material on, but I didn't think they really were germane. It was something that... I'm going to drop a name now, but David Cornwell, John le Carré, once said to me, what you've got to do, he said, on every page is you've got to build jeopardy in. Because that's what keeps us going. And I think what he meant by that was not a ticking time bomb or, is this character going to be murdered? Or it was more kind of, we have to, as writers, make the reader invested in what is going to happen on the next page. And that requires a certain amount of artifice. You have to... So characters whose stories were not absolutely central to the jeopardy of my story, they're there in the background, and they'll be there in the background of the TV adaptation, I'm sure, but in the foreground of the people that I've selected. So it is, in some ways, this is not a work of scholarship. I'm not claiming to write the definitive, complete work. What I'm trying to do is to tell a true story within a wider story.
Yeah. But you're so unique in that they do read like novels. They read like thrillers, but they're true. And that I think that's the appeal of them. So who do you mentioned le Carré, who I know you knew, which is a tremendous thrill for me to just... he met John le Carré, that's enough for me. But who are your influences in terms of your writing style?
Well, I think I set off... He's not much read now, but Bruce Chatwin.
That's not a name I thought.
Well, I was a huge Bruce Chatwin fan, and his sort of stories that combine real research. He's rather unfashionable now, and he sort of fell from grace rather when it was revealed that some of the stuff that he was presenting as history was actually imagined. So we're on different sides in that story, but I didn't know that at the time. He's such a vivid writer of reality, I think. Yet it reads, in Patagonia, reads like a sort of extraordinary novel. So he was very influential. I mean, a lot of those sort of spy writers, actually. I mean, it's no accident, I think, that certainly in British letters, many spies become novelists. I mean, if you think of the list, it's rather remarkable. I mean, not just David Cornwell, who was himself an MI5 and MI6 officer, but Graham Greene, Somerset Maugham, Ian Fleming,
Ambler dabbled,
John Buchan. Yeah. They had all been in the intelligence game at some point, and I think that's not accidental. I think because so much of espionage is about imagination. It's about taking on roles, trying to persuade other people, reading people, trying to create an imaginary world, and that's what novelists do. So I think there's a clear line, I think, between the sort of the secret world and the sort of public world of novel writing.
So you feel those are the people that... Dayton? Is that
absolutely, Dayton.
That they're all
completely brilliant. Yeah. I mean, who sort of... And that paciness, that way that... Oh, hello. Can you still hear us? That maintaining pace and introducing readers into a real world, they're often a different thing, So aligning those together is often the greatest challenge. And there are periods in everybody's life where nothing happens. If you're writing the whole life of Kim Philby, for example, some of it's incredibly exciting. A lot of it's really not. And I'm pretty ruthless. If it's not moving me along,
Then you don't go.
I just don't go there.
One more question before we open it up, which is it's mainly you focused on World War II to Cold War.
Yeah.
And is that partly because the records are there and obviously you love it? All right, gentlemen. Okay.
It's lovely. We're having a disco.
Would you ever venture outside those?
Well, I would. I mean, the very simple, prosaic reason for that my time scale is becoming more modern, is that
you're running out.
I'm running out of people.
Yeah.
And having living witnesses is so wonderful, because having somebody alive who can say to me, I remember it vividly, the room smelled of fresh croissant, it was a rainy day, I got odd socks on. Those are the little details that if you put them into a non-fiction book, you cleave the reader to you in a way. And when people leave written records, they often why would you mention that you'd had odd socks that day? So the written records can only take you so far. That said, declassified records, which I do a lot of, so MI5 now routinely declassifies its material after 50 years. Those are wonderful because they have a particular quality, because they are meant to be secret. They're written by people who never expected them to be read by anybody outside the sort of secret circle. And so therefore they're honest in a way that most government files aren't. Most government records are designed to produce a particular impression on the reader. These ones, the MI5 files, are written in real time. So when it goes wrong, as it frequently does, they actually write in the margins, we're completely here. This is disastrous, and I hate Freddie. And
it's always false.
Yeah, exactly. And didn't come into work yesterday because I had a headache or whatever. So you do get a little bit of that patina of sort of real life taking place in those. But so I need the living witnesses, and actually having a living protagonist is makes all the difference. So the Gordievsky book that I wrote a book about a double agent called Oleg Gordievsky, and I interviewed him for hours and hours and hours in his safe house where he'd lived for 30 years, and that was wonderful, because he was a wonderful interviewee, because every time I came back and asked him another question, he would have remembered something else. He had this extraordinary memory. So for me, that's wonderful. So I'm getting kind of more and more kind of modern at the moment.
Right.
I mean, the new one, again, is a Cold War story, but it's getting closer to our time.
Fantastic. Well, should we open it up to the floor?
Lovely.
Thank you. Ben, could you tell us a little bit about how easy the decision was for Margaret Thatcher to send the SAS in? Because they weren't very respected at the time, and she was a new Prime Minister. And secondly, is it true that she went back to the Regent's Park Barracks to meet them after the operation?
Yes, it is true, and I'll come to that. It was a very bold decision. I mean, she was told by her advisors that the best scenario would be 40% casualties. So 4 out of 10 of both the hostages and the SAS going in would be injured or killed in this operation. And nonetheless, she went ahead and did it. I mean, if it had gone the other way, if it really had ended in that kind of bloodbath, her premiership would have come to a premature end. And I suspect the SAS would have been disbanded. As you rightly say, there were already moves within the sort of army establishment to get rid of the SAS. They were considered to be a kind of rogue element. They weren't sufficiently controlled. But oddly enough, they were largely unheard of, too, at this point. I mean, the SAS was still a very shadowy organisation. If you ask people in the streets, 1 in 10 might have heard of them, but no more than that. So the stakes were incredibly high for her. And she was presiding over a cabinet that was partly disloyal. If it had gone wrong, this would have been a disaster for her. The fact that it went right was the making of her premiership. It really was. And you asked if she and she knew it too. I mean, it was a calculated gamble. She was a proper politician, Thatcher. Whatever you feel about her, she had very, very strong political instincts. And sure enough, yes, she did. She turned up at Regent's Park Barracks not quite, about half an hour after all the soldiers had arrived there. They were all still clad in their full uniform. They were soaked in tear gas. They were carrying their gas masks. They got rid of their weapons. They'd all been collected. So they were all drinking beer in Regent's Park barracks, and she and Dennis turned up and began to wander among them, sort of shaking hands, saying, "Hello, hello, how are you doing?" And she had very big hair at that point, and they were watching themselves on television. So it was running on a spool, the assault on the embassy. And at one point, she sort of walked in front of it, and somebody shouted at her, "Oi, you, Mrs. Sit down," which is not normally how you spoke to Margaret Thatcher. And sure enough, she sort of bobbed under. So they were all, in sort of post-surreal way, they were all sort of watching themselves on television. And people noticed at the time that as she was wandering among them, she had a sort of tear in her eye. I mean, that could have been emotion. I reckon it was tear gas. Margaret Thatcher was not the sort of person. She didn't cry easily, Thatcher, and I think she realised that. And there were photographs of her taken with these guys in full SAS kit. She knew exactly what she was doing.
Brilliant.
Who took the decision to put it on live television?
Well, that was taken independently by the different TV companies. I mean, interestingly, ITN had a secret camera at the back, which they had smuggled into a set of flats. And so they were filming it live as it was taking place. That was another real gamble, because if the gunmen had been watching television inside the embassy, they would have seen the assault taking place. The fact is, MI5 had actually disconnected that so that they wouldn't be able to do it. But the SAS didn't know that. And if the government had known that they were filming it live, there would have been an almighty row. But in a way, that was not something that the government had much control over. They couldn't stop the live television. These were zoom cameras from long distance. It wouldn't happen today. I mean, interestingly, the cordon around the building was actually, by modern standards, pretty small. I mean, you could wander into Hyde Park, and people did. People were beyond the barriers watching this thing take place. Nowadays, they would have cleared the entire area. And even the policemen were within submachine gun range of the people inside that building. Again, you wouldn't have that. I mean, it was incredibly dangerous, really, and very brave. But no, so those decisions to do it live were run immediately. And all the television channels flipped over, except for ITN, which couldn't go over immediately because it was Coronation Street was on. and there are some British institutions that may not be interrupted. So Coronation Street ran for another minute and a half, and then they flipped over.
Anyone else?
In some of your books, in particular in the Cold War, like the Russians came across to me as very paranoid and a bit inept, quite frankly. Are you ever worried you're being tailed, or there's a man with an umbrella near you on a train, or what?
I think they have bigger fish to fry than me, I'm glad to say. But no, I've never felt that. And a funny thing is, some of these books, so for example, the Gordievsky story, which was a disaster for the KGB. I mean, it was a calamity. He hollowed out the KGB for about 10 years and then escaped, and it's an incredible escape. I mean, and he's loathed by the sort of intelligence establishment in Russia. Nonetheless, that book is published in Russian, and actually is quite popular in Russia. So funnily enough, I think, even though in the same way that we like reading about Philby, even though that's a disaster for us.
Yeah, true, actually, yeah.
The Russians also are quite interested in this story of their own cataclysmic failure in this example. But I think that I don't have to worry too much about thallium in the tea, I hope. Might be the last things I ever say, but no, I don't think they're after me yet.
Microphone's coming.
It's coming to you.
Hi, Ben. Well, thank you again for being here. My question is for Ben, whether you've considered in the past or would consider writing pure fiction.
Well, yeah, I have from time to time. I suppose I'm nervous of doing so, because one of the things that anchors me to the page is the knowledge that I only have what I know. In a way, it's the reverse of what Matt was talking about earlier. I am held down in probably quite a good way for me by the limits of what I've been able to find out. I can't go beyond that. I think if I was given a blank page and the opportunity to make it up, I wouldn't know where to stop. I mean, I don't even quite know how novelists manage to do that. How do you know when you've finished? I mean, Matt was saying you're never quite finished. I am. I know that when I've exhausted the well of the material that I've got, that's it. And so I think for my kind of writing, and perhaps it's a journalism legacy, but I am both held up by and supported by the factual evidence that I can find, and I'd be nervous of going into a fictional world. Partly, also, I think it might encourage people to think that, well, if he made that up, then how much do we trust what he's written beforehand? Was he making it up all along? And so, in a way, I think there's a danger that I might end up sort of undermining the things I've already written. That's an excuse for saying I'm not sure I'd be really good at writing fiction. Really. I think I'd be useless at it. I mean, I love the real world. I love the madness and the sheer kind of complexity and vividness and oddness of sort of creatures that we are. We seem to be able to create things that feel like fiction, and they're not. And that's wonderful. I mean, the book I'm writing at the moment, believe it or not, is about a KGB officer who, and I'm not going to give much of it away, but it's such an extraordinary story that, again, if you read it as fiction, people would say that's bizarre. He's a spy who became a spy for the West because he suffered from, believe it or not, erectile dysfunction, and believed that the West had medicines that would cure him, which it didn't, because Viagra hadn't been invented, but they pretended they did. So it's if you did that,
you'd never
in a novel, people would say that is the most
ridiculous,
preposterous. Just couldn't have happened. It did, though. That's just a little taster.
Alongside resistance to the Iranian regime, you said the government had a lot of personal motivations. How did that affect your writing of the book?
So the gunman had personal motivations. Yes, I mean, it affected me in the sense that while I felt a certain... Look, they were complicated individuals. They were doing a terrible thing in many ways. But I couldn't help feeling that they were just naive. They weren't these sort of brutal suicide bomber killers. They were more complicated, and they were more interesting than that. I mean, I think if you, it's a funny thing about history at the moment, and we're going through an odd phase, I think, where we have to look at the past and we have to make moral judgments about all of it. It's almost as if history has become a form of kind of ethical accountancy, where this bit is good, that bit is bad, we condemn that, we approve of that. But history's not like that. History is about context. History is about why people do certain things at certain times because they believe certain things or they live in a certain context. And if you remove that from history and you make it just a question of bad terrorists, good SAS, good government, bad, or whatever, you're kind of reducing history to a sort of black and white story. And history isn't black and white. History is filled with greys and shades of grey and great colour too. And so if we turn it into something that is really a sort of finger-wagging exercise, there's no point in that. So I've been quite rigorous, I hope, in this book in not passing moral judgment on these characters, because they have their own world too. And particularly the leader of the group.
Particularly with Salim, the leader, I don't think he was a killer. And you can tell that because he keeps shifting the deadline.
Yeah.
He keeps saying he's going to kill, he keeps moving it. And at one point, I mean, it's just so bizarre that he rings up the police again and says, get the Arab ambassadors here within the hour or I'm going to kill a hostage, puts the phone down. And the police are all like, oh my God, what are we going to do? Then the phone rings again and he's like, and I want 25 hamburgers. So it goes down. It's just...
Absolutely, and he's the most sympathetic character in some ways, because although we don't approve of what he's doing, we understand the dilemma that he facing.
He doesn't want to carry out his threats because he keeps delaying them, and it's one of the other gunmen definitely has those tendencies. Absolutely delivers on them, but Salim and the others, I think they think we're going to fire our guns,
and then we're going to go home.
Yeah, but they've never killed before, and they don't want to start.
And yet they think of, what makes them interesting is they do think of themselves as potential killers.
Yes.
So there's a disconnect there. There's, particularly Salim, whose brother
he's traumatized by this.
Utterly traumatized by this. So his brother was captured by the Revolutionary Guard in Iran, the security service, brutally tortured and murdered, left in the desert. And that's
why he's there. That's why he's in London.
So that's the trigger that it sort of forces him down this road, if you like. But he's in a way, he's an unwilling He's an unwilling recruit to radicalism.
Yeah.
Which again makes him much more interesting, I think. I mean, if we think of these people as having only brutal and monstrous motivation, then we're not going to get anywhere with trying to work out how the world works.
Yeah, but it's also they would have killed them all on day one.
Yeah,
if they were the kind of people.
Absolutely,
yeah.
absolutely.
And in part, the SAS are successful because once they come in, the gunmen kind of fire, and then they panic and throw down their guns, and they're like,
we didn't need to do that.
Yeah.
Exactly. And it's sort of, so it's all messy.
Yes.
And I like the messiness of history. I like that it doesn't run in clear, straight lines. I like that it's all a bit chaotic and hopeless. Because we all are.
But the best fiction is messy. The best characters are messy. So that's what you're reflecting, which is why you feel so close to a novelist.
Yeah,
I think it would be a brilliant novelist. Anyway.
One more thing.
One more question. Oh, sorry.
From your research, did you see any self-reflection from the gunmen at the start where they were like, oh, what am I doing? Or did you really see commitment from them?
No,
Day one.
No, I think it's a very good question. No, their trajectory, if you like, their narrative changes in the course of this book. I mean, they go in there thinking, well, we bought our new trainers, we've sent the new television back to the Middle East, we'll be going home in a couple of weeks, let's get this over and done with quickly, chaps. They discover a very different world when they get inside that building, partly because it's got a policeman. They didn't even think there would be a policeman, really. It hadn't crossed their mind. It was filled with foreigners. There were all these women. They hadn't thought of any of this. And so you can see them. And indeed, this is one of the reasons why Sim is so brilliant, is he's watching them and describing them changing in the course of these 6 days. They begin to fall out with each other. They begin to disagree about what they should be doing. So you've got this sort of their narrative, in a way, takes place at the same time as the other narrative. And I love that. I love the fact that they are different people on day 6 from the people they think they are on day 1.
Well, their demands change as well.
They keep altering their demands. I mean, the first one is that they need a plane to fly home, and they want all these...
They want 91 prisoners freed that are in Iranian jails. And you think, well, that's not going to happen.
That's not going to happen. Thatcher...
How could she do that?
She wouldn't be able to do that, but they hadn't sort of thought it through. They were also dupes. They were also being manipulated by the Iraqi intelligence service. They'd been trained near Baghdad. They'd been given weapons trainings. The guns were brought to them by this very shadowy figure whose codename was the Fox. His real name is Muhammad Ali. And he provided the weapons. And they all came in through the Iraqi embassy. So they were brought in through the diplomatic bag. He gave them the weapons on the morning of the assault and said, whatever you do, don't attack the embassy before 11 o'clock, because at 11 o'clock he climbed on a plane and was never seen again. So he just vanished. So they were being completely manipulated, these guys, which again doesn't make them fully sympathetic, but it does make them in some ways explicable. I think that's what I was looking for.
That's exactly it. I understood them.
Yeah.
In the book. Yeah.
Lovely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Or is it lunch?
There's a lady here at the front. Pregnancy? I'm not. I'm just...
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm Jessica, and I'm talking about pregnancy. Right. Because the ladies are or are not.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in your saying about, I've read the book and it's great. But I think I want to ask, are you bringing that forward as part of the male thing? Or will, in the new bit, are you going to write that in as a thing? Because it was very interesting the way you explained it.
Well, we'll just explain what that was.
Yeah.
I mean, so one of the women was released early on because they thought she was pregnant. She actually wasn't pregnant, but the other hostages pretended that she was. She was hysterical. That's not a good word to use, but she was frantic. She had really lost it almost completely.
She was fainting and vomiting,
and poor old Salim, the lead gunman, did not want a pregnant woman dying on his watch. And also, he was very respectful towards the women in that kind of Arab culture. He didn't want to have women on his hands. So she was released. One of the other women actually was pregnant, and was eventually released. And I think you've incorporated that in.
I have. Yeah. Both those elements are going to be in the show because they're really key, and it's just amazing that the one released when she's not pregnant, then the other one
is held even though she is.
Yes.
And then they work out that actually she's pregnant too.
Yeah.
So we better get rid of her as well. I mean,
And he says he lets her go, and he says, "I hope you and the baby are fine." And,
Yeah, I hope it all goes well for you. And she feels a kind of residual gratitude to him for letting her go. And finds it very hard, I think. She found it very hard to then tell the police everything from the inside because she sort of felt that she was letting him down.
Yeah.
I mean, human relationships are so funny and so fragile and so malleable that actually that's in a way, again, the thing I love about this is that people don't behave really in the ways that they think they are going to. And I guess that's what this book does, I hope, is that it asks that very simple question, which is, if you had been one of those 27 people and you had ended up in this situation, what would you have done? Which of these individuals, and some behaved with great heroism, others did not, which one would you have been? How would you have coped with it? I don't know what I'd have done. I think I'd have probably. There was quite a good library in the. I think I'd have just curled up with a good book and hoped this is all going to go away.
One of them sits there and reads Day of the Jackal.
I mean, it's about the last thing you'd really want to read is about a sort of terrible terrorist plot. But he's going through it. He said, this is rather good, you know. And one of the other hostages said, well, when you finished, can I read it? I mean, they thought they were going to be there for months. You know, very odd, very odd.
Not Susie, and then Dennis.
Stranger than fiction. Nothing is made up. Messy. And how memory is very often distorted or subjective. How do you actually choose when you interview all these people and you know rationally what the proof is, like the three people who said they all heard, saw somebody killed? How do you choose which is the truth?
That's the lovely power that I have, I guess. I mean, that is the sort of Solomon's choice I make. I don't deny it. That is what happens. Is I gather everything I can find out, and then I make the decision about which bits are going to stay and which bits aren't. So that's the element that becomes an imaginative work rather than simply a sort of. If I was a scholarly historian, everything would have to go in, and I would simply allow the reader to pick and choose about what, you know. But that's not what I do. I tell narrative history, so I am pretty rigorous and ruthless about choosing what I think is the truth. You know, and I can't be absolutely certain. I'm not in the sort of truth game quite. I'm in the story game. But it's interesting. I mean, the more people you have telling you a story, the closer you get to what the reality actually was. And it's in a way, it's a sort of numbers game. You know, if I've got 4 SAS saying this and only 1 saying that, and they're all in the same room, are they colluding? Probably not. I have to make a judgment on that.
So basically, you're already writing fiction.
No, I'm shaping a story in a fictive way, but that isn't the same. I firmly believe that I am held back and down by what I know to have taken place. But you have to trust me on that. Dennis.
I think you alluded to the fact that there's a certain amount of distance from an event that needs to take place before maybe you're ready to write it. Maybe the audience or the readership is ready to read it. The intelligence services are ready to release it. All of those things. I'm curious, there's so much happening today, and you're a journalist. In terms of world events in the intelligence game that's been playing out over the last few years or 5 years, what's the best current story that you can't yet tell?
Well, the Ukraine story is an intelligence story. I mean, it's obviously a military story, it's a political story, it's a geopolitical story, but at its heart there is an intelligence element to that will eventually be told. On both sides, I would love to get my hands on that. Not yet, it's much too early, but actually the way that intelligence both informs and deforms political choice. The Iraq War is a brilliant example of that. That was false. That was intelligence that turned out to be wrong. There's a lot of that going on in Ukraine at the moment. I mean, there is an argument that it all kicked off because of a sort of intelligence mess, really, because the FSB was going into Ukraine with huge amounts of money to prepare the invasion, and Putin was being told, it's all going to be fine, boss. They're going to welcome us with flowers and open arms. Actually, they just embezzled the money and ran off with it. And so, the initial response to that was not what Putin was expecting. So, but at every stage, there's an intelligence story to be told in that. And if I can find the right person and the right I need living people who can tell me that story. I hope I live long enough. But I'd love to get my hands on that.
Brilliant. Well, I think it's time for lunch. But everybody, thank you, Ben Macintyre.
Thank you, Will. Thank you. Good to be done.
Thank you.